I'm Megan, 26, and last month I received a formal legal notice that nearly gave me a heart attack. My aunt was demanding $50,000 from me for raising me after my parents died. The shock of seeing that number with all those zeros left me breathless. The same aunt who reminded me daily that I was a burden was now sending lawyers after my hard-earned money. But what happened in that courtroom? The judge's response to her ridiculous claim left her completely speechless. Before I dive into this wild story, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you've ever dealt with entitled family members who think your success belongs to them. Life wasn't always complicated. Until I was 8, I lived in a modest but happy home with my mom and dad in a small suburb outside of Boston. Dad worked as an electrical engineer and mom was an elementary school teacher. They weren't wealthy by any means, but we had enough. I remember weekend picnics at the local park, movie nights with homemade popcorn, and bedtime stories every night without fail. They were loving, attentive parents who made me feel like the most important person in their world. But everything changed on a rainy April evening. My parents were driving home from their anniversary dinner when a drunk driver crossed the median and hit them head-on. I was staying with a neighbor when the police came to deliver the news. At 8 years old, I became an orphan overnight. With no living grandparents and no close family friends who could take me in permanently, custody fell to my mother's sister, Aunt Rebecca, who lived about an hour away with her husband Frank and their 2 children. My cousins Jason and Emily. Jason was 10 and Emily was 12 when I moved in. From the very first day, Aunt Rebecca made it clear that taking me in was a massive inconvenience. "We're adjusting our entire lives for you," she said as she showed me to the unfinished basement room that would become mine. It had concrete floors with a thin carpet remnant, one small window near the ceiling, and walls that were only partially painted. My cousins each had their own beautifully decorated rooms upstairs. "We'll need to tighten our belts now that we have another mouth to feed," she would say at dinner, loud enough for everyone to hear. Even though I knew my parents had left some money and there were Social Security survivor benefits coming in for me, I didn't understand finances then. But I could feel the resentment radiating from her every time she looked at me. The household rules quickly established a clear hierarchy. My cousins had minimal chores, taking out the trash occasionally or setting the table for dinner. I, on the other hand, was assigned daily chores that kept me busy from the moment I got home from school until bedtime. I cleaned bathrooms, vacuumed the entire house, did laundry, washed dishes, and tended the yard. By age 10, I was preparing most weekday dinners while Aunt Rebecca watched television. "You need to earn your keep," she would say. "Nothing's free in this world." Uncle Frank was largely absent from these dynamics. He worked long hours and traveled frequently for business. When he was home, he seemed uncomfortable with how I was treated but never intervened. He would occasionally slip me a few dollars or bring me a small gift. Always when Rebecca wasn't around. "Just hang in there, kid," he'd say with a sad smile. School became my sanctuary. I threw myself into academics, joining every free club and activity I could. The longer I could stay at school, the less time I had to spend at home. Teachers often commented on my maturity and work ethic, not realizing these traits had been forced upon me through circumstance rather than natural development. Everything in my life was a hand-me-down: clothes, shoes, school supplies, even my toiletries were often half-used bottles discarded by my cousins. Meanwhile, Jason and Emily received new items regularly. Emily got a brand new laptop for her 14th birthday. When I needed a computer for school assignments, I was allowed to use the ancient desktop in the family room, but only after everyone else was done with it. The inequality extended to celebrations too. My cousins had birthday parties with friends, cakes, and presents. My birthdays passed with barely an acknowledgement, perhaps a mumbled happy birthday and a cheap card if I was lucky. What I didn't know until years later was that Aunt Rebecca kept a detailed ledger of every expense related to me. Every grocery trip, utility bill, school supply. She meticulously calculated what she considered my portion and recorded it. This accounting didn't include any offsets for the chores I did or the fact that I was essentially their unpaid housekeeper and cook. When I turned 14, I got my first job bagging groceries at the local supermarket. Aunt Rebecca immediately informed me that I would need to contribute to household expenses. "You live here, you help pay," she said, taking 30% of my meager paycheck. The rest I saved carefully, already planning my escape. My cousins never had to work. They participated in expensive sports, went to summer camps, and received allowances. I watched from the sidelines, both literally and figuratively. Emily occasionally showed me small kindness when her mother wasn't looking, helping me with homework or sharing a snack. Jason mostly ignored me, treating me like an unwelcome houseguest who had overstayed. Throughout those years, I developed a thick skin and learned self-reliance out of necessity. I became adept at finding free resources, scholarships for summer programs, and creative ways to participate in activities that didn't cost money. I learned to fix things rather than replace them and became skilled at stretching a dollar further than seemed possible. The emotional toll was significant. I cried myself to sleep many nights, missing my parents and wondering why my own family treated me like an outsider. I developed anxiety about asking for anything, even necessities. I became hyper-aware of taking up space, using resources, or being noticed. I tried to be invisible while simultaneously trying to be useful enough to justify my existence. Looking back, I realized I was living with constant emotional manipulation. Aunt Rebecca would remind me daily that I should be grateful she hadn't sent me to foster care, as if providing the bare minimum for her orphan niece made her a saint. Every meal, every school supply, every doctor's appointment was framed as an extraordinary act of generosity rather than basic guardianship. But through it all, I held on to memories of my parents and the knowledge that this situation was temporary. I would grow up, move out, and create a better life. That determination became my North Star during the darkest times. By my junior year of high school, I was working 2 jobs at the grocery store on weekends and at a local coffee shop 3 evenings a week. My grades never suffered despite the workload. If anything, I became more focused and efficient with my limited study time. Education was my ticket out, and I wasn't going to waste that opportunity. When college application season arrived, Aunt Rebecca made it clear that there would be no financial support from her. "We've done more than enough already," she said dismissively when I brought up the subject of college. So I spent countless hours researching scholarships, grants, and financial aid options. I wrote dozens of essays for scholarship applications, often late at night after finishing my homework and household chores. The hard work paid off. I was awarded a substantial merit scholarship to the state university, covering about 75% of my tuition. Between that financial aid and my savings from years of part-time work, I could afford to attend. The day the acceptance letter arrived was one of the happiest of my life, though Aunt Rebecca managed to dampen even that joy. "Don't expect to come running back here if you can't make it," she said, barely glancing at the scholarship letter I'd proudly shown her. "And you'll need to leave most of these things here," she added, gesturing around my sparse basement room. "We paid for them." After all, the items she referred to were mainly the bed, desk, and bookshelf that had been in the basement before I arrived, old worn furniture that had been relegated there years before I came to live with them. I bit my tongue and nodded, having learned long ago that arguing was pointless. Moving into my dormitory that August felt like taking my first free breath in 10 years. My room was tiny and I shared it with another scholarship student named Amelia, but it was mine. No one there knew me as the orphan charity case. No one was counting how many minutes I showered or how much food I ate. For the first time since my parents died, I felt like I could just be Megan. During my freshman orientation, I met Rachel, Zoe, and Tyler, who would become my closest friends and chosen family. They came from different backgrounds, Rachel from a wealthy Chicago suburb, Zoe from a rural farming community, and Tyler from a blue-collar family in Detroit, but we bonded over our shared ambition and work ethic. None of them could understand why I almost never mentioned my family or went home for breaks, but they never pushed when I changed the subject. I limited contact with Aunt Rebecca's family during college, calling only on major holidays and visiting briefly during winter break my freshman year. That visit confirmed what I already knew: there was no place for me in that house. My basement room had immediately been converted into Frank's home office after I left, and I slept on the couch during my stay. I never spent another night there after that first visit. Financially, college was a constant struggle. Even with my scholarship, I needed to work 20-30 hours a week to cover living expenses, books, and the remaining tuition. I took early morning shifts at a campus cafe, evening hours at the library, and picked up odd jobs like tutoring and house sitting. Summers were spent working full-time, often holding down 2 jobs simultaneously. Despite these challenges, I thrived academically. I majored in marketing with a minor in digital media, maintaining a 3.8 GPA throughout. My professors noticed my drive and connected me with an internship opportunity at a growing tech company during my junior year. That internship was transformative. I was finally able to apply my creativity and work ethic in an environment where they were valued and rewarded. The company, Next Level Technologies, offered me a part-time position during my senior year and hinted at full-time opportunities after graduation. For the first time, I could see a clear path forward. I worked harder than ever that final year, balancing my courses, my job at Next Level, and a research assistantship that helped cover expenses. Graduation day was bittersweet, as I watched other students celebrate with their families, taking photos and receiving proud hugs. I felt the absence of my parents acutely. Aunt Rebecca's family didn't attend, claiming a scheduling conflict with Emily's soccer tournament. My chosen family filled the gap as best they could. Rachel's parents brought me flowers. Zoe organized a small celebration dinner, and Tyler's mom hugged me like I was her own daughter. Their kindness was a balm, but it couldn't completely heal the wound of being essentially fameless on such an important day. The Monday after graduation, I started full-time at Next Level Technologies as a junior marketing specialist. My starting salary wasn't impressive, but it was enough to rent a small studio apartment and cover my basic needs without working multiple jobs. For the first time in my adult life, I furnished my tiny space with thrift store finds and Facebook Marketplace bargains, creating a cozy home that was entirely my own. Those first few years of true independence were challenging but joyful. I learned to budget carefully, build credit, and navigate adult responsibilities without the safety net many of my peers enjoyed. I made mistakes like the time I underestimated my tax liability and had to work weekend gigs for 3 months to pay the bill, but each error taught me valuable lessons. My career at Next Level progressed steadily. I consistently exceeded my targets and brought innovative ideas to campaigns. My manager, Samantha, became a mentor, recognizing my potential and advocating for my advancement. By my second year, I was promoted to marketing specialist, and by the end of my third year, I became a senior marketing specialist with a substantial raise at 25. I was earning more than I ever thought possible growing up in Aunt Rebecca's basement. I moved to a nicer one-bedroom apartment, started contributing to a retirement account, and even took my first real vacation, a week-long trip to Costa Rica with Rachel. I still lived frugally compared to many of my peers, saving aggressively and avoiding unnecessary luxuries. The financial insecurity of my childhood had instilled habits that were hard to break. I occasionally posted about career milestones on social media, mostly to stay connected with college friends and colleagues. I wasn't particularly active online, but I did share when I received my promotion to senior specialist, including a photo of me holding flowers in our office. That post, as I would later learn, caught Aunt Rebecca's attention in a way I never anticipated. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I received the certified letter. I signed for it before leaving for work, assuming it was something related to my apartment lease renewal. When I opened it during my lunch break, my stomach dropped and my hands began to shake. The letter was from a law firm representing Rebecca Thompson, my aunt, and contained a formal demand for payment of $50,342.17 for child-rearing expenses and associated costs incurred during the period of guardianship from April 2004 to August 2014. Attached was an itemized statement breaking down the supposed expenses: $14,600 for food and nutrition, $9,800 for housing accommodation, $7,540 for utilities usage, $6,250 for transportation services, $5,475 for clothing and personal items, $4,120 for educational support, and $2,557.17 for miscellaneous necessities. The letter stated that I had 30 days to arrange payment or face legal action. I read it 3 times, unable to process what I was seeing. My hands were shaking so badly that my coworker Diane asked if I was okay. I mumbled something about a family issue and went to the bathroom, where I sat in a stall trying not to hyperventilate. Once the initial shock subsided, I called Aunt Rebecca directly, something I hadn't done in over a year. She answered on the 4th ring. "So you got my letter," she said by way of greeting, her tone smug and self-satisfied. "Rebecca, what is this about? You can't seriously expect me to pay you for raising me. You were my legal guardian. That was your responsibility," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Don't take that tone with me," she snapped. "We sacrificed everything for you. We gave you a home when no one else would. Now you're making good money at that fancy job of yours, posting pictures of your success online, and it's payback time." Payback for what? For making me work since I was 14, for treating me like an unpaid servant, for taking part of my paychecks all through high school. My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "We clothed you, fed you, put a roof over your head for 10 years, she countered. "You think that was free? Frank and I could have taken nice vacations, remodeled our kitchen, put that money toward our own kids' futures. Instead, we spent it on you. What about the survivor benefits from Social Security? What about the money my parents left? Where did that go?" I asked, voicing suspicions I'd had for years. There was a telling pause before she answered. "That barely covered anything. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to raise a child? Of course you don't. You're just an ungrateful little—" I cut her off. "I'm not paying you, Rebecca. What you're asking is ridiculous and probably illegal. I was a child placed in your care after my parents died. That doesn't make me financially indebted to you for life. We'll see what the judge has to say about that. She said coldly, I've kept every receipt, every record. I can prove what you owe us. Good luck with that, I replied, ending the call before she could say anything else. I sat at my desk staring blankly at my computer screen for several minutes. The audacity of her demand was stunning, but somehow not entirely surprising. Aunt Rebecca had always viewed me as a burden, a liability. Why wouldn't she try to monetize that perception once she thought I had the means to pay? That evening I called my friend Jessica, who had recently graduated from law school and was working at a small firm specializing in family law. After listening to my story and reviewing the demand letter I'd scanned and sent her, she was emphatic. This is complete nonsense, Megan. Legally, guardians cannot retroactively charge their wards for basic care. It's like a parent trying to bill their adult child for raising them. The courts would laugh this out of the room, so I can just ignore it, I asked hopefully. I wouldn't ignore it, but you don't need to worry. Let me represent you pro bono. This is so clearly frivolous that it shouldn't take much time. Jessica's confidence was reassuring, but I still felt sick about the whole situation. Over the next few days, Jessica did some digging and discovered interesting information. Aunt Rebecca and Uncle Frank were experiencing financial difficulties. They had invested heavily in a friend's business venture that had failed spectacularly. Their home had a second mortgage, and they were carrying significant credit card debt. My recent promotion and apparent success had likely triggered Rebecca's desperate attempt to extract money from me. More concerning was what Jessica learned about my parents' estate. Through court records, she discovered my parents had left a modest life insurance policy and some savings that should have been held in trust for me until I turned 18 or used solely for my benefit while I was a minor. There was no record of how those funds had been used, and Aunt Rebecca had never mentioned them to me after the initial days following my parents' death. We should counter with a request for accounting of your parents' estate, Jessica advised, if they misused funds that were legally yours. That's a much more serious issue than this ridiculous demand for reimbursement. Together, we decided to fight rather than attempt to settle. Jessica filed a formal response rejecting the claim and requesting dismissal. She also included a counter request for a full accounting of my parents' estate and any benefits received on my behalf during my minority. The court date was set for May 15th. As it approached, I cycled through emotions: anger at the injustice, anxiety about facing my aunt in court, and deep sadness that my only blood relatives viewed me as nothing more than a financial transaction. I had nightmares about being forced to return to that basement room, about working forever to pay a debt that could never be settled. Jessica helped me gather documentation: my high school work records showing I'd been employed continuously from age 14, bank statements showing regular withdrawals labeled household contribution, and even old school records indicating I qualified for free lunch despite the household income being above the threshold, suggesting my aunt hadn't been providing adequately for me. I also reached out to former neighbors and teachers who had witnessed aspects of my life with Aunt Rebecca's family. Mrs. Winters, who lived next door during my high school years, provided a written statement about regularly seeing me doing yard work and household chores while my cousins played or socialized. My high school counselor, Mr. Barnes, offered a statement regarding concerns he'd had about my home situation, including notes from meetings where Rebecca had been dismissive of my academic achievements and college aspirations. The night before court, I barely slept. This confrontation represented not just a legal battle but a reckoning with the childhood that had been stolen from me, first by tragedy and then by the very person who should have protected me in my parents' absence. The county courthouse was busier than I expected for a Tuesday morning. Jessica met me on the steps at 8:30 a.m., looking professional and confident in a navy suit. She squeezed my hand reassuringly as we walked inside. "Remember, the law is completely on our side," she said. "Just stay calm and let me handle the talking unless the judge directly addresses you." We were directed to a small courtroom for small claims and family court matters. As we took our seats, I spotted Aunt Rebecca entering with a man in an expensive-looking suit, her lawyer presumably. Uncle Frank wasn't with her, but to my surprise, both my cousins were. Emily, now 30, made brief eye contact with me before quickly looking away. Jason, 28, stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Seeing them stirred complicated emotions. We had grown up in the same house for 10 years, yet were practically strangers. I wondered if they supported their mother's outrageous claim or were simply there out of family obligation. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Marilyn Watkins entered. She was an older woman with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She reviewed the case file for a few moments before addressing the room. "Thompson v. Mitchell," she announced. This is a claim for reimbursement of child-rearing expenses. I've reviewed the initial filing. Ms. Thompson, as the plaintiff, your attorney will present first." Aunt Rebecca's lawyer stood, introducing himself as Harold Blackwell. He was polished and articulate, exactly the type of expensive attorney I'd worried about facing. "Your Honor, my client provided full care and support for her niece, Megan Mitchell, for 10 years following the tragic death of the minor's parents. During this time, my client and her husband incurred substantial expenses directly related to raising an additional child, expenses they had not planned for and which created financial hardship for their family." He gestured toward a thick binder of documents. "We have meticulously documented these expenses, categorized by type, and calculated conservatively. The total amount of $50, $342.17 represents only the basic costs associated with food, shelter, clothing, education, and other necessities provided to Ms. Mitchell from ages 8 to 18. Judge Watkins interrupted. "Counselor, on what legal basis are you claiming these expenses are reimbursable?" Ms. Thompson was the legal guardian, correct? "Yes, Your Honor, but this guardianship was accepted with the understanding that it would be temporary until other arrangements could be made. No suitable alternatives emerged, then my clients found themselves in a decade-long financial commitment they had not anticipated. This was a complete fabrication. There had never been any discussion of temporary arrangements or alternative placements." I felt my face flush with anger, but Jessica placed a calming hand on my arm. The judge looked skeptical but allowed him to continue. Blackwell called Aunt Rebecca to testify. She took the stand, ranging her face into an expression of put-upon nobility that I recognized all too well. "Mrs. Thompson, please explain to the court the circumstances under which you became your niece's guardian," Blackwell prompted. "It was such a shock when my sister and her husband died," Rebecca began, her voice carefully modulated to convey emotion. "We got the call late at night, and of course we immediately said we would take Megan in. What else could we do? She was family." She dabbed at non-existent tears. "We thought other arrangements would be made eventually. Perhaps my sister's husband's family would step forward, or a more suitable guardian would be found. But weeks turned into months and months into years. We already had 2 children of our own, and adding a third was a significant burden." "Can you describe the financial impact?" her lawyer asked. Rebecca nodded solemnly. "It was substantial. Our grocery bills increased dramatically. Megan had a healthy appetite and was constantly growing. Our utility bills went up with another person showering, using electricity, needing heat. We had to buy clothes, school supplies, pay for doctor visits and medications when she was sick." She gestured toward the binder. "I kept careful records of everything because Frank and I wanted to be transparent about how the survivor benefits were being used, but those benefits didn't come close to covering the real cost." This was the first I'd heard about her careful accounting being related to survivor benefits. My suspicion that she had misused those funds grew stronger. Rebecca continued with increasingly exaggerated claims how she'd had to purchase an additional car mainly to transport me to school activities. Untrue, I walked or took the bus. How they'd renovated their home to accommodate me. The unfinished basement room had received a coat of paint at most. How they'd provided me with the best clothes and supplies. Laughable given the hand-me-downs I'd worn throughout childhood. We even had to pass up a family vacation to Disney World because the expense of raising Megan had strained our finances so severely, she claimed, her voice cracking with manufactured emotion. This particular lie stung. They had gone to Disney World when I was 14, leaving me with a neighbor because it was a special trip just for their immediate family. As Rebecca's testimony continued, she painted a picture of herself as a selfless martyr who had sacrificed her family's financial security for her orphan niece. She claimed I had been difficult, ungrateful, and dismissive of their generosity. According to her narrative, I had contributed minimally to the household despite their struggling finances. And now, she concluded, looking directly at me for the first time, she's doing very well financially. She has a good job, a nice apartment. Meanwhile, we're still recovering from the financial strain of raising her. All we're asking is for her to take responsibility and compensate us for a portion of what we spent giving her a good life when no one else would." Judge Watkins had been taking notes throughout Rebecca's testimony, occasionally glancing up with an unreadable expression. She asked several clarifying questions about the timeline and the guardianship arrangement before allowing Blackwell to present the financial records. He methodically went through categories of expenses, showing spreadsheets and even some actual receipts that Rebecca had supposedly saved for over a decade. The level of detailed accounting was disturbing. It suggested Rebecca had seen me as a financial liability from the very beginning. tracking every penny spent as if preparing for this moment. As I listened to their presentation, anxiety knotted my stomach. Even knowing the law was on my side, the sheer volume of documentation they had prepared was intimidating. Rebecca's performance as the sacrificing aunt was convincing. If I hadn't lived through the reality, I might have believed her myself. By the time Blackwell concluded the plaintiff's case, nearly an hour had passed. Judge Watkins called for a 15-minute recess before the defense would present. In the hallway, Jessica reassured me, "They have quantity of documentation but no legal standing. Guardian-ward relationships don't work this way. You don't need to worry." I nodded, trying to believe her, but the knot in my stomach remained. Through the window I could see Rebecca speaking animatedly with her lawyer. My cousin stood awkwardly nearby, not really part of the conversation. Emily glanced in my direction again, and this time I thought I detected something like embarrassment in her expression. When court resumed, it would be our turn to present the truth. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I had nothing to be ashamed of. I had survived Rebecca's household and built a life for myself despite her, not because of her. Now it was time to set the record straight. When court resumed, Jessica approached the podium with confident strides. Unlike Blackwell's dramatic opening, her approach was straightforward and matter-of-fact. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's entire claim rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of legal guardianship. When Rebecca Thompson became Megan Mitchell's guardian following the death of her parents, she assumed legal responsibility for Megan's care. This responsibility is not alone to be repaid once the child reaches adulthood or achieves financial stability." She paused to let that sink in, but even setting aside the legal absurdity of this claim, the factual basis presented by the plaintiff is deeply flawed and misrepresentative of the actual circumstances of Ms. Mitchell's upbringing. Jessica first addressed the legal question, citing several precedent cases where courts had firmly rejected attempts by parents or guardians to seek retroactive compensation for basic child rearing. She emphasized that guardianship, like parenthood, comes with legal obligations that cannot be converted into debt. "Your Honor, if we accepted the plaintiff's reasoning, every child could be presented with a bill upon reaching adulthood. This would fundamentally undermine our society's understanding of family responsibility and obligation." Judge Watkins nodded thoughtfully as Jessica spoke. When she finished addressing the legal aspects, Jessica moved on to the factual disputes. "Now, regarding Mrs. Thompson's characterization of the financial burden she undertook, we have evidence that contradicts many of her claims." Jessica called me to testify first. I took the stand, swore to tell the truth, and faced the courtroom. Rebecca glared at me while her lawyer whispered something in her ear. "Ms. Mitchell," Jessica began, "when did you start working for income?" "I got my first job at Anderson's Grocery when I was 14, the summer before starting high school," I replied. "I worked there weekends during the school year and added a job at Coffee House during my junior year, working 3 evenings a week." "And what did you do with your earnings?" "Aunt Rebecca required me to contribute 30s of every paycheck to household expenses. She called it room and board. The rest I saved for college and used for personal necessities like clothes, school supplies, and toiletries." Jessica showed the court my high school employment records and bank statements from that period, highlighting the regular withdrawals labeled household. "Did your cousins, who were older than you, also work and contribute to household expenses during this time?" "No, Jason didn't work until after high school graduation, and Emily babysat occasionally but kept all her earnings for personal spending. They received allowances, I never did." "Were you aware of Social Security survivor benefits being paid on your behalf after your parents' death?" "Not until recently. I knew there had been some financial provision from my parents, but Aunt Rebecca managed all of that. I never saw any of those funds or knew how they were used." Jessica then walked me through the living conditions and treatment differences between me and my cousins. I described the unfinished basement room, the extensive chores assigned only to me, the second-hand clothes while my cousins received new items, and the general atmosphere that constantly reminded me I was an unwanted burden. "Ms. Mitchell, did you ever receive any substantial gifts, special trips, or luxury items from the Thompsons during your time in their home?" "No. Birthday gifts, if acknowledged at all, were typically small practical items like socks or school supplies. I was excluded from their family vacation to Disney World when I was 14. They left me with a neighbor. Christmas gifts were minimal compared to what my cousins received. I never had a birthday party or special celebration during those 10 years. As I spoke, I noticed Emily looking increasingly uncomfortable, shifting in her seat and avoiding eye contact with her mother. Jason maintained his stony expression, though I thought I detected a slight furrowing of his brow when I mentioned the Disney trip. Rebecca's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to suggest I was exaggerating the differences in treatment or that I had been a difficult, ungrateful child who required extra resources and attention, but my responses remained steady and factual. I wasn't interested in painting myself as a perfect child or my aunt as a cartoon villain. The unembellished truth was damning enough. After my testimony, Jessica called Mrs. Winters, our former neighbor. The older woman described seeing me doing yard work and household chores throughout my teenage years while my cousins appeared to have few responsibilities. She recounted bringing over food when I was left alone during the family's Disney vacation and expressed concern about how I seemed to be treated differently from Rebecca's biological children. Megan was always polite and hardworking, Mrs. Winters testified. I often saw her shoveling snow before school, mowing the lawn in summer, or carrying groceries while her cousins played with friends. I mentioned my concerns to Rebecca once, and she said Megan needed to earn her keep and learn responsibility. Mr. Barnes, my high school counselor, testified next. He described meetings where Rebecca showed little interest in my academic achievements or college prospects despite my excellent grades and test scores. When I suggested AP classes given Megan's academic performance, Mrs. Thompson said they couldn't afford extra fees for optional courses. When I mentioned scholarship opportunities, she seemed actively disinterested, changing the subject to her biological children's activities instead. Jessica then called a surprising witness, a former caseworker from the Social Security Administration who had handled benefit distributions in our county during the relevant period. She confirmed that as my legal guardian, Rebecca would have received monthly survivor benefits intended for my care, benefits that would have totaled approximately $1,500 per month depending on my parents' prior earnings. These benefits are specifically intended to replace the financial support lost when a parent dies, the caseworker explained. They are meant to be used for the child's food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and education. The guardian receives them on behalf of the child but is expected to use them solely for the child's benefit. When asked if guardians were required to provide accounting of how these funds were spent, she explained that regular audits weren't standard but could be requested if misuse was suspected. This testimony seemed to visibly unsettle Rebecca. She whispered urgently to her lawyer, who looked increasingly concerned. Jessica next presented documentation regarding my parents' modest estate. Through probate records, she demonstrated that my parents had left approximately $62.00 in life insurance and savings that should have been placed in trust for me or used for my direct benefit. There was no record of how these funds had been managed or spent. Your Honor, Jessica continued, if Mrs. Thompson wants to discuss financial obligations, we should first address what happened to the survivor benefits and inheritance that were legally intended for Megan's care. By our calculation, those funds would have totaled between $240.00 and $270.00 over the 10-year guardianship, far exceeding the amount Mrs. Thompson claims to have spent. Rebecca's face had turned pale. Her lawyer requested a brief recess to confer with his client, which the judge granted. During the 15-minute break, I saw them engaged in intense conversation, Rebecca gesturing angrily while Blackwell appeared to be attempting to calm her. When court resumed, Jessica concluded our defense with a simple statement. Your Honor, not only is the plaintiff's claim legally baseless, but the evidence suggests that the real financial impropriety may have been committed by Mrs. Thompson herself in her management of funds intended for Megan's benefit. We ask that the court dismiss this claim with prejudice and order an accounting of the survivor benefits and inheritance funds that should have been used for Megan's care. Blackwell attempted to salvage their case in his closing statement, pivoting to emphasize the extraordinary circumstances and financial hardship his client had experienced, but his arguments had lost their earlier confidence, and he avoided mentioning the survivor benefits or inheritance entirely. Judge Watkins thanked both sides and announced she would take a 30-minute recess to consider her ruling. Those 30 minutes felt like hours as I sat quietly with Jessica, trying not to make eye contact with my aunt or cousins across the room. When the judge returned, her expression was serious and determined. Whatever she was about to say, I sensed it would be definitive. Judge Watkins adjusted her glasses and surveyed the courtroom before speaking. Her voice was clear and authoritative. I've reviewed the evidence and arguments presented by both sides in this unusual case. Before delivering my ruling, I want to address some fundamental principles that apply here. She folded her hands on the bench. Legal guardianship is not a business arrangement or a loan agreement. When an adult assumes guardianship of a minor child, they take on the legal responsibility to provide food, shelter, clothing, education, and care for that child. This responsibility is analogous to that of a parent and does not create a debt to be repaid when the child reaches adulthood or achieves financial success. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the judge continued. Mrs. Thompson, when you became your niece's guardian following the tragic death of her parents, you assumed these legal responsibilities. The court did not appoint you as a paid caretaker entitled to reimbursement, but as a guardian with duties to protect and provide for a vulnerable child in your care. Judge Watkins picked up a document from her bench. What concerns me greatly in this case is the evidence regarding Social Security survivor benefits. Mrs. Thompson, as guardian, you would have received these benefits on behalf of your niece. These funds were not payment for your services but were intended to provide financial support for the child's needs. She looked directly at Rebecca. Mrs. Thompson, did you receive monthly survivor benefit payments for Megan Mitchell during the period of guardianship? Rebecca cleared her throat. Yes, Your Honor. And approximately how much were these monthly payments? Rebecca glanced at her lawyer before answering reluctantly. About $1,500 per month, Your Honor. The judge's expression hardened slightly. That amounts to approximately $180, zero over 10 years, yet you're claiming you spent only about $50, zero on your niece's care during this period. Can you explain this discrepancy? Rebecca shifted in her seat again. Well, there were many expenses not included in our accounting, and maintaining a household is costly: utilities, mortgage, property taxes. Judge Watkins interrupted. Mrs. Thompson, survivor benefits are specifically designated for the child's direct needs, not general household expenses that would have existed regardless. Do you have records showing how these funds were specifically used for Megan's benefit? We didn't keep separate accounts, Rebecca stammered. Everything went into the family budget. I see, the judge said, her tone making it clear that she indeed saw all too well. And what about the inheritance funds of approximately $62, zero left by Megan's parents? At this, Rebecca's composure cracked visibly. Those funds were also used for household expenses and investments for Megan's future. Do you have documentation of these investments? Were they maintained in a separate account for Megan's benefit? Not exactly, Your Honor. We had financial difficulties during that period and needed to consolidate resources. Judge Watkins sat back, removing her glasses. Mrs. Thompson, let me be very clear. When you became Megan's guardian, you took on both the responsibility of care and the fiduciary duty to properly manage any funds designated for her benefit. Based on the testimony and evidence presented today, I have serious concerns about how you fulfilled that fiduciary duty. She replaced her glasses and continued. As to the matter before this court today, your claim for reimbursement of child-rearing expenses, I find it entirely without legal merit. Parents and guardians cannot retroactively bill children for basic care. The fact that Megan has achieved financial success as an adult does not create an obligation for her to reimburse you for fulfilling your legal responsibilities as her guardian. Rebecca's face flushed with anger, but Judge Watkins wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the evidence presented regarding survivor benefits and inheritance funds, I am deeply troubled by what appears to be potential misappropriation of funds that were legally intended for Megan's care and benefit. She shuffled some papers on her desk. Therefore, I am ruling as follows. First, the plaintiff's claim for reimbursement is dismissed with prejudice. Second, I am ordering Mrs. Thompson to provide a complete accounting of all survivor benefits received on Megan Mitchell's behalf and all funds from the Mitchell estate within 30 days. Judge Watkins looked directly at Rebecca. Mrs. Thompson, I want to be absolutely clear about the seriousness of this matter. Failure to provide this accounting or evidence of misuse of these funds could result in further legal consequences, including potential liability for the full amount of benefits and inheritance with interest. She turned to me with a softer expression. Ms. Mitchell, once this accounting is provided, you may have grounds for a separate civil action to recover funds that were intended for your benefit but were misused. I would encourage you to consult with your attorney about that possibility. Rebecca suddenly stood up, her face contorted with indignation. This is outrageous. We took that girl in when no one else would. We clothed her, fed her, put a roof over her head, and this is the thanks we get. Mrs. Thompson, control yourself, Judge Watkins said sharply. Your characterization of your actions as extraordinary generosity rather than basic legal obligation speaks volumes. The court has made its ruling. Rebecca's lawyer placed a restraining hand on her arm, whispering urgently in her ear. She sank back into her seat, speechless with rage. Judge Watkins delivered her final words on the matter. Let me be perfectly clear to anyone who might consider a similar claim in the future. Children are not indentured servants. they do not incur debt by virtue of being raised, whether by biological parents, adoptive parents, or legal guardians. The obligation runs in the opposite direction. Adults who take on the responsibility of raising children are legally and morally obligated to provide for them without expectation of future reimbursement. She brought down her gavel. This case is dismissed. Court is adjourned. The courtroom fell silent except for the rustling of papers as people gathered their belongings. Rebecca sat stunned, her earlier confidence completely deflated. Her lawyer whispered to her, but she seemed beyond hearing, staring straight ahead with a mixture of shock and fury. I felt a strange lightness, as if a weight I'd carried for years had suddenly lifted. The judge had not only rejected Rebecca's absurd claim but had seen through to the deeper injustice, the misuse of funds that should have supported me through those difficult years. As we prepared to leave, I noticed Emily approach hesitantly, hanging back from her mother. "Megan," she said quietly, I didn't know about any of this, about the benefits or the inheritance, or that Mom was keeping track of every penny spent on you." I wasn't sure how to respond. Emily hadn't been cruel during our childhood, but she hadn't intervened either. She had been a teenager herself, benefiting from the preferential treatment without questioning its fairness. "I believe you," I finally said, "but you saw how she treated me. You knew it wasn't right." She nodded, eyes downcast. "I did. I should have said something, done something. I'm sorry." Before I could respond, Rebecca's sharp voice cut through. "Emily, we're leaving now." Emily gave me one last apologetic glance before hurrying after her mother. Jason followed without looking in my direction. They filed out of the courtroom, Rebecca's back rigid with unspent fury, her dreams of easy money thoroughly shattered. Jessica squeezed my shoulder. "You did great, and Judge Watkins was fantastic. I couldn't have hoped for a better ruling." "What happens now?" I asked, still processing everything. "Now we wait for the accounting she's been ordered to provide. But based on her reaction, I suspect she knows she won't be able to justify how those funds were used. We'll likely have grounds for a significant recovery claim." As we walked out of the courthouse into the spring sunshine, I felt something unexpected, not just relief or vindication, but a sense of closure. For the first time, someone in authority had acknowledged the wrong that had been done to me and held Rebecca accountable. No amount of recovered funds could restore my lost childhood, but the judge's words had restored something equally valuable, a sense that justice was possible. The aftermath of the court hearing unfolded in ways I couldn't have predicted. Rebecca predictably missed the 30-day deadline to provide an accounting of the survivor benefits and inheritance funds. Her lawyer filed for an extension, which was granted. But the eventual documentation she submitted was incomplete and inconsistent. Working with Jessica, we filed a civil suit to recover the misappropriated funds. The process was lengthy and complex, involving forensic accountants and multiple hearings, but ultimately successful. The court determined that Rebecca had indeed misused at least $175. Zero funds that should have been used for my care or held in trust for me. The final judgment ordered her to repay $210, zero including interest. She didn't have the funds available and was forced to take out a second mortgage on her home and liquidate investments. The financial reckoning she had tried to impose on me had instead come full circle to her. I never saw Rebecca again after the final hearing. She refused to look at me as she left the courtroom, her earlier self-righteousness replaced by bitter defeat. Uncle Frank, who had not attended any of the proceedings, called me once to apologize for not doing more during my childhood. The apology felt hollow after so many years of silent complicity, but I acknowledged it civilly before ending the call. Jason cut off contact completely, seemingly taking his mother's side in the dispute. I hadn't expected anything different. We had never formed a meaningful relationship during our years living under the same roof. His absence from my life continued as it had effectively been since I left for college. Emily surprisingly reached out several times. Our relationship evolved cautiously from awkward coffee meetings to occasional dinners. She shared that the court case had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her childhood and her mother's behavior. "I always knew you were treated differently," she admitted during one of our meetings. "But Mom explained it away, saying you needed more discipline, or that you were difficult, or that we had to be careful with money because of the expense of raising you. I accepted those explanations because they were convenient and because I benefited from the arrangement." Her honesty was refreshing, and over time we developed a tentative friendship, not the close sisterly bond that might have been possible under different circumstances, but a relationship with its own value nonetheless. The financial settlement provided unexpected security, but the emotional aftermath of the court case was more complex. Having my experiences validated by the legal system was powerfully healing, but it also reopened old wounds. With Jessica's encouragement, I began seeing a therapist specializing in childhood trauma and family estrangement. Dr. Marshall helped me process not just the recent court battle but the years of emotional neglect and differential treatment that had shaped my self-perception. I came to understand how the constant message that I was a burden, an obligation, had affected my relationships and sense of worth. "You developed extraordinary resilience and self-reliance," Dr. Marshall observed during one session, "but those adaptations came at a cost. You learned to make yourself small, to need little, to never impose. Now you have the opportunity to unlearn those patterns and discover who you are when you're not in survival mode." That process of discovery became my focus over the following years. I learned to set boundaries, to ask for help when needed, to take up space unapologetically. I allowed myself small luxuries without guilt and practiced receiving kindness without feeling indebted. My professional life continued to flourish. Next-level technologies promoted me to marketing manager, and I led several successful campaigns that significantly increased our market share. The financial security from both my career and the settlement allowed me to purchase a small but charming two-bedroom condo, my first real home that was truly mine. The settlement money also provided an opportunity to honor my parents' memory in a meaningful way. I established a scholarship fund for students who had lost parents, naming it after my mother and father. Each year, the Mitchell Memorial Scholarship would help one student with similar circumstances to mine pursue higher education without the financial struggles I had faced. My chosen family, the friends who had supported me through college and beyond, remained central to my life. Rachel, Zoe, and Tyler were there to celebrate each victory and provide comfort during difficult moments. We created our own traditions and celebrations, proving that family could be built on love and mutual respect rather than merely biological connections. Jessica and I remained close as well, our relationship evolving from attorney-client to genuine friendship. Her belief in my case and willingness to represent me had been pivotal, and I was deeply grateful for her advocacy. 3 years after the court case, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Uncle Frank, but the return address wasn't the family home I had grown up in. He explained that he and Rebecca had divorced. The financial strain and revelations from the court case had been the final breaking point in an already troubled marriage. "I want you to know that I deeply regret not protecting you," he wrote. "I saw what was happening, how differently Rebecca treated you, and I failed to intervene. I told myself it wasn't that bad, that you were resilient, that challenging Rebecca would only make things worse. Those were all excuses for my cowardice. You deserved better, and I will always be sorry that I didn't provide it." The letter included a small package, a silver bracelet that had belonged to my mother. "Rebecca kept this after your parents died," Frank explained. "I found it recently while moving out and wanted you to have it. It's a small thing, but it's something of hers that should have been yours all along." That delicate bracelet became a treasured possession, a tangible connection to the mother I had lost too soon. I wore it on special occasions, imagining her wearing it during happy moments in her too short life. The experience with Rebecca had taught me painful but valuable lessons about family, obligation, and self-worth. Blood connections don't automatically create love or ensure protection. Some people view family relationships transactionally, keeping score and expecting repayment for basic decency. Others understand that family, whether biological or chosen, is about mutual support without ledgers or balance sheets. I chose to build my life around the latter understanding. The friends who had become my family, the colleagues who valued my contributions, the new connections I formed as I moved forward, these relationships were based on genuine care rather than obligation or indebtedness. As for forgiveness, that remained a complex and evolving process. I didn't forgive Rebecca in the sense of excusing her actions or welcoming her back into my life, but I did work to release the anger and resentment that bound me to the past, understanding that holding on to that bitterness would only continue to harm me. Dr. Marshall helped me distinguish between forgiveness and reconciliation. You can forgive someone, meaning you no longer allow their actions to control your emotional state, without reconciling with them or condoning what they did, she explained. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the person who harmed you. That perspective allowed me to gradually let go of the white-knuckled anger I had carried for so long. I would never forget what happened or pretend it wasn't damaging, but I could choose not to be defined by it. 5 years after the court case, my life had transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable during those dark days in Rebecca's basement. I had a fulfilling career, a lovely home, meaningful relationships, and a sense of purpose. The scared, neglected child who had been told repeatedly that she was a burden had grown into a woman who knew her own worth. If you're watching this and struggling with similar family dynamics, whether it's feeling like an outsider, being treated as a burden, or facing unreasonable expectations, please know that you deserve better. Family should be a source of support and love, not exploitation or conditional acceptance. Sometimes the family we choose builds us up more than the family we're born or placed into. And if you're in a position to help a child who has lost their parents or is otherwise vulnerable, remember Judge Watkins' powerful words: children are not indentured servants. They do not incur debt by virtue of being raised. The care and protection you provide isn't alone to be repaid, it's the fulfillment of a sacred obligation to the next generation. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to hear about your experiences with family expectations and boundaries in the comments below. Have you ever had to establish boundaries with family members who saw your success as something they were entitled to share in? How did you handle it? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if this resonated with you. Your support helps others find stories that might help them navigate their own challenging family situation. Remember, your worth isn't determined by what others demand of you, but by the strength, resilience, and compassion you bring to the world.